It took decades of ambition, rivalry, and secret diplomacy to set the stage. But in one shot, the world changed forever. This is the story of the Great War, World War I, the conflict that reshaped nations, empires, and the very fabric of modern life. Imagine Europe in the middle of the 19th century, a continent alive with ambition, tension, and the restless energy of nations on the rise. Empires, some centuries old, wielded power with an almost casual confidence. Yet, beneath the surface, forces were stirring that would reshape the world. Nationalism, the fervent belief that a people's destiny should be tied to a shared language, culture, or history, was awakening across the continent. From the sun-baked hills of Italy to the windswept plains of Prussia, men and women dreamed of new nations, new borders, and the power that came with them. It was a time of great promise, but also a time of danger. In the bustling cities, factories belched smoke into the sky as the engines of the Industrial Revolution roared to life. Railways connected distant regions, telegraphs transmitted news at lightning speed, and powerful armies trained under new doctrines of war. Europe was modernizing, growing richer and stronger, but this newfound strength also made it fragile. The same nationalism that inspired unity could just as easily fuel conflict. Alliances formed in secret, old rivalries simmered, and the ambitions of kings, emperors, and generals began to clash with the realities of a changing world. In the south, the Italian peninsula was a patchwork of states, kingdoms, and principalities. For centuries, these lands had been divided and contested, a chessboard for larger powers. But now a new spirit of Italian nationalism burned brightly. The Kingdom of Sardinia, guided by the brilliant statesman Count Camillo de Cavour, sought to unify the Italian people. With the support of France, they challenged Austrian dominance over northern Italy. Through daring campaigns, brilliant strategy, and decisive battles, Sardinia gradually absorbed its neighbors. By the 1860s, the disparate states of Italy were bound together under a single crown, and the dream of a unified Italy, long considered impossible, had been realized. Further north, a different force was quietly reshaping the map: Prussia. Under the iron leadership of Otto von Bismarck, the small but efficient Prussian state pursued a single goal: unifying the German-speaking lands under one empire. Through diplomacy, manipulation, and calculated wars, Prussia first defeated Austria, consolidating the northern German states into the North German Confederation. Then, in a swift and stunning campaign against France in 1870, Prussia proved its military dominance. The grandeur of the Palace of Versailles became the stage for a new empire, the German Empire, crowned in triumph and destined to become one of Europe's most powerful nations. Across the continent, the old empires faced decline. The Ottoman Empire, which had once ruled vast swathes of Europe and the Middle East, was faltering. In the Balkans, revolts and uprisings weakened imperial control, while Russia eyed the region with strategic ambition. Western European powers, wary of Russia's growing influence, convened the Berlin Conference to limit expansion, while Bismarck maneuvered to protect Germany's position through alliances with Austria, Hungary, and later Italy. The stage was set, alliances formed, and the continent edged closer to a storm that would engulf the world. And yet, despite the careful plotting of diplomats and the ambitions of rulers, no one could foresee the spark that would ignite this powder keg. Europe in the 19th century was a place of brilliance, innovation, and incredible potential, but also a continent primed for catastrophe. The story we are about to tell begins in this delicate, electrified moment where ambition, nationalism, and diplomacy intersected, and where the world would be changed forever by the greatest war it had ever seen. As the 19th century drew to a close, Europe had been transformed by unification and industrialization, but these changes brought both opportunity and tension. Italy, once fragmented into multiple kingdoms and duchies, had emerged as a single nation-state. Yet its borders left ambitions unfulfilled. Venice, Trentino Alto Adige, and other Italian-speaking regions remained outside the new kingdom, leaving nationalists eager for more. Meanwhile, in the north, Germany's rise had reshaped the balance of power. The German Empire, disciplined, industrialized, and militarily formidable, stood as a new heavyweight in continental politics. Its victory over France in 1870 had not only humiliated the French, but also taken the territories of Alsace and Lorraine, lands whose loss festered as a wound in the French national psyche, fueling a desire for revenge that would simmer for decades. Germany's power was not only military but also economic. Industrialization surged across the empire, with coal, steel, and railroads laying the foundation for economic dominance. Bismarck, ever the master strategist, strengthened Germany's position through complex diplomacy, forming the Triple Alliance with Austria, Hungary, and Italy. This alliance promised mutual defense and sought to create a balance of power on the continent. In response, France, determined to reclaim lost prestige and territory, quietly aligned with Russia, setting the stage for the intricate web of alliances that would soon entangle Europe. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, once the mighty ruler of the Middle East and southeastern Europe, faced relentless decline. In the Balkans, nationalist movements threatened to tear the empire apart. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro sought independence, while Russia, portraying itself as the protector of Slavic peoples, intervened to expand its influence. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 further weakened Ottoman control, leaving its European territories reduced to near nothing. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, sought to consolidate its holdings, annexing Bosnia and Herzegovina, territories whose acquisition angered Serbia and heightened tensions in the region. Across Western Europe, Britain maintained its traditional policy of splendid isolation, focused on protecting its empire and naval supremacy. Yet the rapid rise of Germany's industrial economy and naval power did not go unnoticed. Britain's concerns over a German fleet capable of challenging the Royal Navy helped shape its eventual alignment with France and Russia in the Triple Entente. Europe in this period was like a clock wound too tightly. Each alliance, each territorial ambition, each nationalist aspiration was a spring waiting to release its energy. And when that spring finally gave way, the consequences would be catastrophic. Colonial expansion further complicated matters. Germany, eager to claim a share of the overseas world, began acquiring territories in Africa and the Pacific. Its presence challenged long-established empires, particularly Britain and France, who had already carved much of the globe into colonies. In 1884, Germany hosted the Berlin Conference, ostensibly to regulate the scramble for Africa. But in practice, it sought to assert its influence and stake its claim in the imperial race. Across the world, colonies became pawns in European power struggles, their resources, populations, and strategic positions fueling conflicts far from the European continent. The map of Europe by the early 20th century was a patchwork of tension and ambition. France nursed its wounds and sought alliances to counter German strength. Germany, confident in its military and industrial power, maintained a vigilant eye on both East and West. Austria-Hungary, a multi-ethnic empire, faced the challenge of keeping its diverse population united while managing nationalist uprisings. Russia, vast but underdeveloped, dreamed of extending influence southward into the Balkans and westward into Central Europe. And Italy, the new nation, coveted territories promised but not yet delivered, waiting for an opportunity to expand its borders. Everywhere, the undercurrents of war were present. Armies expanded, conscription became more widespread, and military technology advanced rapidly. Artillery, rifles, and machine guns were far more lethal than in previous generations, while railways allowed troops to be deployed with unprecedented speed. Diplomacy, which might once have prevented conflicts, now struggled to keep pace with the speed of alliances, rivalries, and ambitions. By 1914, Europe was a tinderbox. One spark could, and would, ignite a war that no one could fully control. The summer of 1914 was deceptively calm. Across Europe, governments, diplomats, and military leaders went about their business, confident in their ability to control the delicate balance of power. Yet beneath the surface, tensions had reached a fever pitch. Alliances were like tightly stretched cords, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Nationalism, long a simmering force, had reached boiling point in the Balkans, where Serbs, Bosnians, and other Slavic peoples dreamed of uniting under their own flags, free from the domination of empires. Then, on June 28, 1914, in the heart of Sarajevo, a city pulsing with cultural and political complexity, history turned abruptly. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, were traveling through the city in a motorcade. Their visit, intended to demonstrate imperial presence and authority in the ethnically turbulent region of Bosnia, became the stage for a tragedy that would shake the world. Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist affiliated with the secret society known as the Black Hand, had been waiting along the route. Driven by a vision of South Slavic unity and anger at Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia, he seized his moment. With a pistol in hand, Princip fired. Both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were mortally wounded. In an instant, the assassination sent shockwaves through Vienna, Belgrade, and beyond. Austria-Hungary, enraged by the attack and determined to assert its dominance in the Balkans, blamed Serbia for the assassination. Vienna's government saw this not merely as a local crime, but as a direct challenge to the empire itself. The response was swift and uncompromising. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia demanding harsh concessions, including allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in investigations within Serbian territory, a demand that struck at the very heart of Serbian sovereignty. Serbia, eager to avoid conflict but unwilling to surrender its independence, accepted most of the demands but rejected a few that would compromise its sovereignty. Austria-Hungary saw this as insufficient. Behind the scenes, Germany offered a blank check, pledging unconditional support to its ally. The stage was set for a chain reaction that would engulf Europe. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Slavic peoples, began to mobilize in defense of Serbia. The Tsar and his generals, aware of Germany's power but driven by both nationalism and the desire to assert influence in the Balkans, ordered partial mobilization, which escalated tensions further. Germany, interpreting Russian mobilization as an act of aggression, issued ultimatums demanding a halt. When Russia ignored them, Germany declared war. The dominoes fell quickly. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, marking the official start of hostilities. Germany, executing its military plans, declared war on Russia on August 1st and on France 2 days later. The infamous Schlieffen Plan, designed to avoid a two-front war, called for a rapid invasion of France through neutral Belgium. When German troops crossed Belgian territory, Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany on August 4th. In a matter of days, what had begun as a regional conflict in the Balkans had escalated into a full-scale European war. Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, France, and Britain were now embroiled in a conflict whose scale and speed shocked the world. Even distant empires and colonies, from Japan in the Pacific to India in Asia, would soon be drawn into the struggle. The July crisis revealed how interconnected Europe had become. Diplomacy, intended to prevent war, instead accelerated it. Alliances, treaties, and mutual defense agreements created a web that no leader could fully control. Decisions made in Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg rippled across the continent, triggering mobilizations, declarations, and ultimatums that made war inevitable. Yet amid this political and military tension, life continued in European cities, unaware of the scale of catastrophe approaching. Parades, markets, and summer festivals carried on, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing even as armies prepared for mobilization. The contrast between civilian life and the looming war was stark, a reminder of how quickly ordinary existence could be upended by historical forces beyond any single person's control. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand, a single event in a single city, became the spark that ignited the European tinderbox. It highlighted the fragility of diplomacy and the dangers of entangled alliances. A young nationalist's bullet had not only killed an archduke, but had in effect set the stage for a conflict that would engulf the globe. A war whose scale, horror, and consequences were beyond anything Europe had ever seen. By the end of July 1914, Europe was on the brink. Mobilization orders crossed borders. Soldiers prepared to march to the front. Families packed supplies and prayed for safety. In towns and cities, the sense of imminent danger was palpable, yet few could imagine the industrialized total war that awaited them. The stage was set, the players were in position, and within weeks, Europe would descend into 4 years of devastation, redefining the world forever. As July 1914 gave way to August, the world hurtled into war. Europe, once confident in its diplomacy and military planning, now faced a conflict of unprecedented scale. Soldiers marched from villages and cities across the continent, leaving behind tearful families and anxious communities. Mobilization was swift and meticulous. Railways carried troops to the front lines with clockwork precision, while factories shifted to wartime production almost overnight. Germany, executing the Schlieffen Plan, aimed for a quick knockout of France, hoping to avoid the nightmare of a two-front war with both France and Russia. The plan relied on speed, precision, and surprise. German armies would sweep through Belgium, circle Paris, and crush France before turning east to face Russia, whose massive but poorly equipped army would take longer to mobilize. Yet, even the most meticulously drafted plans could not account for the unpredictability of human action and the stubborn resilience of nations. In Belgium, resistance was fierce. Though vastly outnumbered and outgunned, Belgian soldiers slowed the German advance, buying critical time for the French and British to prepare. The civilian population suffered immediately. Towns were shelled, villages burned, and civilians caught in the crossfire faced death, displacement, and destruction of their homes. Stories of massacres and the burning of towns spread across Europe, galvanizing public opinion against Germany. The German army pressed on, crossing the Meuse and advancing toward the French border. At Mons, British expeditionary forces, composed of volunteers and professional soldiers, clashed with the Germans for the first time. Outnumbered, the British forces fought a disciplined retreat, leaving behind stories of courage and sacrifice that would be remembered for generations. French forces engaged the Germans at the Battle of the Frontiers, attempting to halt the invasion, but the sheer strength and speed of the German advance forced a withdrawal toward the Marne. By early September 1914, the First Battle of the Marne had begun, a pivotal confrontation that would determine the fate of Western Europe. French reserves, hastily transported to the front, joined the battle alongside the British Expeditionary Force. The German advance, though initially successful, was finally checked. Exhausted and overextended, German troops could not break through. In a dramatic counterattack, French forces pushed the invaders back, stabilizing the front lines and ending hopes for a quick victory. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan had profound consequences. Both sides dug in, creating the first trench networks that would define the Western Front. Trenches stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, a continuous scar across the landscape. Life in the trenches was harsh and dehumanizing. Soldiers endured mud that sucked at their boots, lice that infested clothing, rats as large as cats scavenging for scraps, and the constant threat of artillery shells and sniper fire. Sleep was rare, food was meager, and disease was rampant. The war, once imagined as heroic and short, became a test of endurance and survival. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war unfolded differently. Russia, vast in territory and population, launched offensives into East Prussia and Galicia. Early Russian successes, including victories at Gorlice Tarnow, were overshadowed by logistical nightmares and poor communication. The German army, smaller but better equipped and more disciplined, executed encirclements that devastated Russian formations. Entire armies were captured or annihilated, and tens of thousands of soldiers died from exposure, hunger, or combat. Despite these losses, Russia's sheer manpower allowed it to continue fighting, creating a grinding attritional war that drained both sides. In the Balkans, Austria-Hungary faced rebellion and instability. Serbia, fiercely independent and determined, resisted repeated invasions. Battles at Ser and Kolubara demonstrated Serbian resilience as they repelled larger Austro-Hungarian forces. Yet victory came at a cost. Thousands were killed, and the civilian population suffered from occupation, requisitioning, and famine. Meanwhile, Bulgaria, aligning with the Central Powers, threatened to expand the conflict further in the region, foreshadowing the complex Balkan campaigns to come. The war at sea was equally transformative. The British Royal Navy, seeking to blockade Germany and cut off supplies, dominated the North Sea. Germany, unable to match the British fleet, turned to U-boats to strike at Allied shipping. Submarine warfare introduced a new level of danger for civilian and military vessels alike. Ships were sunk without warning, and the seas became a theater of terror. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania in 1915, with over 1,000 civilians killed, sparked outrage and foreshadowed the eventual involvement of the United States. As 1915 progressed, new technologies and tactics reshaped the battlefield. Artillery became heavier and more precise, capable of leveling entire villages in minutes. Machine guns, once rare, now dominated the front, mowing down waves of advancing soldiers. Poison gas, first deployed by Germany at Ypres, introduced a new horror. Chlorine and phosgene gas caused choking, blindness, and agonizing death. Soldiers wore primitive masks, but the psychological toll was immense. Gas attacks, along with artillery bombardments, created a landscape of fear and uncertainty that stretched far beyond physical injuries. On the Western Front, early battles like Second Ypres and Artois demonstrated the deadly stalemate of trench warfare. Neither side could gain significant territory despite immense losses. Military planners devised complex strategies, including creeping barrages and limited offensives, but the technology and tactics of the time favored defense. Men lived, fought, and died in trenches, often mere meters from the enemy, their existence defined by mud, blood, and the constant thrum of artillery. Across the Mediterranean, the war expanded. The Gallipoli campaign, launched by Britain and France, aimed to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open supply routes to Russia. Soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and France faced impossible terrain, entrenched Ottoman defenders, and scorching summer heat. Thousands died from combat, disease, and exhaustion. The campaign became a symbol of courage and strategic miscalculation, demonstrating the global scale of the conflict and the interconnectedness of theaters far from Europe's heart. By the end of 1915, the initial phase of the war had settled into a grueling stalemate. Trenches, barbed wire, and fortified positions dominated Europe's landscapes. Millions of soldiers endured appalling conditions, with little to show for their sacrifices. Civilians too suffered. Food shortages, economic strain, and the constant presence of war shaped daily life. The conflict, which many had imagined would be short and decisive, had transformed into a long, industrialized struggle that would test the limits of human endurance. By 1915, World War I had ceased to be a purely European struggle. The war had stretched across continents, oceans, and colonies, drawing in nations and peoples far from the Western and Eastern fronts. It was no longer just a conflict between Germany, France, and Britain. It was now a global war, touching every corner of the map. In the Middle East, the once mighty Ottoman Empire had joined the Central Powers, threatening to destabilize British and Russian interests in the region. Control over the Dardanelles, the Bosporus, and the Suez Canal meant control over crucial trade and supply routes. Britain, fearing the disruption of its lifeline to India and the Persian oil fields, launched the Gallipoli campaign in April 1915. The campaign was ambitious. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand forces, collectively known as the Anzacs, would storm the peninsula, capture Constantinople, and open a new front. Yet the campaign quickly descended into catastrophe. Ottoman defenders, entrenched and strategically positioned on the rugged hillsides, repelled wave after wave of assaults. The terrain was unforgiving. Steep cliffs, narrow beaches, and scorching heat sapped men of energy before they even reached enemy lines. Disease, dysentery, and dehydration took as many lives as bullets and artillery shells. For 8 months, stalemate reigned, with no significant territorial gains. By January 1916, the Allies evacuated, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead. Gallipoli became a symbol of courage and sacrifice, but also of miscalculated strategy, and it cemented the reputation of Ottoman commanders, especially Mustafa Kemal, who would later become the founder of modern Turkey. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, British and Indian forces advanced along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Their goal was to secure oil-rich territories and to weaken Ottoman control. The Siege of Kut, 1915 to 1916, highlighted the brutal realities of desert warfare. British troops were surrounded by Ottoman forces, cut off from supplies, and subjected to extreme heat and disease. After months of siege and starvation, the garrison surrendered, marking a rare but humiliating defeat for the British Empire. The campaign continued, however, ultimately leading to the capture of Baghdad in 1917, a victory that came at tremendous human cost. In Africa, the war took on yet another dimension. Germany's colonies, though far from Europe, became strategic targets. French, British, and Belgian forces launched campaigns across German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, and Togoland. Battles were fought not only against German troops, but also against harsh climates, disease, and difficult terrain. In East Africa, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, commanding German forces, waged a guerrilla campaign that tied down tens of thousands of Allied troops for the duration of the war. Even in distant colonies, World War I demanded men, resources, and resilience. Back in Europe, the stalemate on the Western Front continued. Soldiers endured trench warfare, where mud, cold, and disease were as deadly as bullets. Every offensive came at enormous cost. In early 1915, the Second Battle of Ypres introduced a terrifying new weapon: poison gas. German troops released chlorine gas, which spread with the wind into Allied positions. Soldiers struggled to survive with improvised masks and scarves, yet many perished in agony. The battlefield had changed. Modern warfare was no longer about charges and cavalry. It was industrialized, mechanized, and dehumanizing. Artillery had become the dominant force on the battlefield. Shells rained down with devastating precision, obliterating trenches, forests, and towns. Entire landscapes were transformed into lunar wastelands, where craters replaced fields and shattered trees punctuated the horizon. Machine guns ensured that advancing troops were mowed down in seconds, leading to horrendous casualties. Commanders experimented with creeping barrages and coordinated attacks, yet the front lines barely budged. Stalemate was entrenched in both geography and strategy. The Isonzo front in northern Italy exemplified the horrors of mountain warfare. Italy, having joined the Allies in 1915 with promises of territorial expansion, faced Austria-Hungary along the rugged Isonzo River. Battles were fought in freezing winter conditions and blistering summer heat. Avalanches, rock slides, and artillery fire claimed thousands. 11 offensives were launched over 2 years, each yielding minimal gains. Soldiers endured mud, snow, and hunger while their families back home worried in vain, sending letters that often never reached the front. Despite the human cost, Italy persisted, driven by nationalistic ambitions and the hope of reclaiming Italian-speaking territories. At sea, the war grew increasingly perilous. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare sought to cut off Britain from vital supplies. Merchant ships carrying food, coal, and raw materials were prime targets. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania in May 1915, which killed 1,198 people, including 128 Americans, shocked the world. Though the United States remained neutral, outrage mounted, and the incident foreshadowed America's eventual entry into the war. Naval engagements from the North Sea to the Mediterranean showcased new strategies and technologies, including mines, U-boats, and dreadnought battleships, forever altering maritime warfare. The war also accelerated technological development. Aviation, initially used for reconnaissance, evolved rapidly. Fighter planes engaged in dogfights above the trenches, while Zeppelins and bombers targeted cities and supply lines. Communication improved with the use of telegraphs, telephones, and radio, allowing for more coordinated and complex operations. The industrial capacity of nations was stretched to the limit, and economies became war machines, producing endless munitions, uniforms, and supplies. Meanwhile, the human toll deepened. Civilians faced shortages, rationing, and the constant fear of bombardment. Families were torn apart, and communities were transformed. Women stepped into roles previously reserved for men, working in factories, offices, and farms. They produced the weapons, ammunition, and food that sustained armies, forever altering social dynamics and setting the stage for greater gender equality in the decades to come. By the end of 1916, the war had become a global struggle with no clear end in sight. Millions had died or been wounded. Territories across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East had been ravaged, and economies were strained to the breaking point. Stalemate on the Western Front contrasted with fluid and brutal campaigns in the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe. World War I had transformed into a total war, engulfing entire societies, economies, and cultures in a struggle that tested the limits of endurance, ingenuity, and human resilience. By 1917, the world had been consumed by war for nearly 3 years, and the toll was staggering. Exhaustion weighed heavily on both soldiers and civilians. Europe had been transformed into a continent of mud, ruin, and grief, where each day brought new casualties, shortages, and despair. The Western Front had stabilized into a bloody stalemate, while other theaters, from the Middle East to Africa, revealed that this conflict was no longer confined to Europe. In Germany, the strain was beginning to show. Food shortages plagued cities, with civilians lining up for hours just to secure meager rations. Coal was scarce, and industrial output faltered under constant Allied bombardments and strikes by exhausted workers. Morale fell sharply. The British naval blockade, designed to choke the Central Powers economy, had succeeded beyond expectations. Starvation loomed over millions. In factories, women and older men struggled to replace the soldiers who had been sent to the front. Even the nation's leadership faced pressure as growing unrest threatened to spill into revolution. Meanwhile, Russia was approaching a breaking point. The country had suffered catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, and its armies were poorly equipped compared to the modernized German and Austro-Hungarian forces. Soldiers were underfed, underarmed, and exhausted. Transportation networks were inadequate, and supply lines often failed. The abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in March 1917 marked the collapse of imperial authority. The provisional government attempted to continue the war, but it faced relentless pressure from soldiers, workers, and peasants who were desperate for peace, land reform, and stability. The summer of 1917 brought the Kerensky Offensive, an attempt by the provisional government to revive Russian military momentum. Initially, morale surged as troops advanced, but the offensive quickly faltered. German and Austro-Hungarian forces counterattacked, leaving Russian armies decimated and demoralized. Desertion became widespread, and revolutionary sentiment grew. By October, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in the October Revolution, promising peace, land, and bread. One of their first acts was to negotiate an armistice with Germany, culminating in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. Russia exited the war, ceding vast territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, to the Central Powers. This withdrawal freed up German forces, allowing them to concentrate their efforts on the Western Front. Across the Atlantic, the United States had watched the conflict with growing concern. President Woodrow Wilson had maintained neutrality, but Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, which sank American ships without warning, challenged the nation's safety and principles. The discovery of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany promised Mexico territory in the American Southwest if it joined the war against the U.S., was the tipping point. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, signaling the arrival of a new, fresh force that would soon reshape the war's balance. The entry of America brought more than soldiers. It brought industrial and logistical power. Factories across the United States ramped up production of rifles, artillery, uniforms, and vehicles. Supplies and food were shipped across the Atlantic in unprecedented quantities. By the summer of 1918, the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, under General John J. Pershing, began arriving in Europe in significant numbers. Though initially inexperienced in trench warfare, the Americans were well-fed, motivated, and eager to fight. Their presence revitalized Allied morale and helped offset the exhaustion and attrition that had crippled European armies. Meanwhile, Germany launched a final gamble, the Spring Offensive of 1918, orchestrated by General Erich Ludendorff, aimed to break the Allied lines before American forces could arrive in force. Using troops freed from the Eastern Front after Russia's withdrawal, Germany achieved rapid initial gains. French and British positions were penetrated, and German forces advanced miles into Allied territory. Cities and countrysides alike were devastated as the offensive swept across France and Belgium. Yet, despite early success, the offensive ultimately failed. Supply lines could not keep pace with advances, troops were exhausted, and the fresh American forces, along with remaining British and French soldiers, began pushing back. The Second Battle of the Marne marked the turning point. Combined Allied forces launched a counter-offensive, employing coordinated attacks, improved artillery, and strategic use of tanks. German forces were gradually pushed back, losing territory and momentum. By late summer 1918, Germany's hope for a decisive victory had evaporated. The Central Powers were crumbling from both external pressure and internal unrest. In Austria-Hungary, the empire's multi-ethnic composition proved its undoing. Slavic, Czech, Slovak, and Romanian populations seized the opportunity to declare independence. Czechoslovakia emerged from the empire's northern regions, while the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia, formed in the south. Italy advanced into territories promised in secret treaties, though disputes over the Istrian Peninsula and Dalmatian coast foreshadowed post-war tensions. The Ottoman Empire, battered and isolated, negotiated an armistice as Allied forces captured Damascus and other key cities in Palestine and Syria. In Africa, remaining German colonies fell one by one to Allied forces, leaving only German East Africa under the determined leadership of Leto Vorbeck, who continued his guerrilla resistance until the very end. Back in Germany, social unrest intensified. Sailors mutinied in Kiel, spreading revolt to other ports and industrial centers. Workers' councils formed, mirroring structures seen in Russia, and public protests demanded an immediate end to the war. Kaiser Wilhelm II, seeing no way to restore order, abdicated on November 9, 1918. A new republic was proclaimed, seeking peace before Germany descended into full revolution. 2 days later, on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the armistice was signed, officially ending 4 years of unprecedented global conflict. The war left Europe in ruins. Cities, towns, and countrysides were devastated. Trench networks, artillery craters, and chemical contamination scarred landscapes. Populations mourned millions of dead, while survivors returned home traumatized by their experiences in the mud, gas, and chaos of battle. Economies were shattered, food shortages persisted, and political systems struggled to stabilize. The social and psychological impact of 4 years of total war would ripple for decades. The war's end, however, did not resolve the underlying tensions that had ignited it. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, would impose harsh penalties on Germany, sowing seeds of resentment that later fueled the rise of extremism. Austria-Hungary was dissolved, new nations emerged, and the Ottoman Empire's territories were divided under British and French mandates. The global map had changed, yet the world remained fragile, teetering between peace and renewed conflict. World War I's conclusion marked both triumph and tragedy. It showcased human resilience, innovation, and the capacity to endure unimaginable hardship, while also highlighting the destructive potential of industrialized warfare. The United States' entry and decisive contribution highlighted the growing influence of new global powers, while Europe struggled to recover physically, economically, and socially. In hindsight, 1917 to 1918 was the period when the war's momentum shifted, when exhausted empires faltered, revolutions erupted, and new powers emerged. It was a time of decisive battles, revolutionary upheavals, and strategic gambles that ultimately paved the way for the armistice. Yet the world the soldiers returned to was vastly different, scarred by loss and haunted by uncertainty. The war had changed the very fabric of society, and its echoes would shape the 20th century in ways that no treaty could fully contain. The guns had fallen silent on November 11, 1918, yet Europe was far from at peace. The armistice ended the fighting, but it did not heal the wounds of a continent ravaged by 4 years of total war. Cities lay in ruins, Villages were abandoned, and infrastructure, railways, bridges, factories, was destroyed. Farms were devastated, leaving millions without food. Populations mourned the loss of loved ones, many of whom had perished in the mud and blood of trenches or on distant battlefields in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest that approximately 18 million people died, including 8 million civilians, and countless more were wounded, traumatized, or displaced. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919 compounded this suffering, sweeping across Europe and beyond, claiming more lives than the war in some regions. Millions more faced hunger, disease, and social instability in its aftermath. Europe's population had been physically and psychologically scarred, and the social fabric of societies was fraying under the weight of grief and hardship. In Germany, the newly established Weimar Republic faced a near impossible task. The abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the collapse of imperial authority left a vacuum. Political instability was immediate. Radical movements emerged on both ends of the spectrum. Communists, inspired by the Russian Revolution, staged uprisings in Berlin and other industrial centers. Nationalists, humiliated by Germany's defeat and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, embraced the stab-in-the-back myth, claiming the military had not truly been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by civilians, politicians, and Jews. Hyperinflation, unemployment, and shortages of basic goods further fueled social unrest. Families struggled to rebuild lives amid economic collapse. Veterans returned to cities that could not provide jobs or housing, their psychological scars largely ignored. The war had created a generation traumatized, angry, and uncertain of its place in society. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, sought to create a lasting peace, but it did so at a heavy price for Germany. The treaty imposed territorial losses, including Alsace-Lorraine to France, and stripped Germany of its overseas colonies. The military was severely limited, the army capped at 100,000 men, tanks and aircraft banned, and submarines prohibited. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war under the infamous War Guilt Clause, and was required to pay reparations that would cripple its economy for decades. Austria-Hungary was dismantled entirely, its territories divided to create new nations such as Czechoslovakia, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Austria. The empire's collapse left millions of ethnic minorities living under new governments, often struggling for recognition and autonomy. Tensions simmered beneath these freshly drawn borders, setting the stage for conflicts that would resurface in the decades to come. In the Middle East, the war's legacy was equally profound. The Ottoman Empire had effectively collapsed. Turkey, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, negotiated the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, establishing modern borders for the new Turkish state. Meanwhile, the British and French mandates, designed to govern former Ottoman territories, sowed discontent. Promises of Arab independence had been largely ignored, leaving resentment that would fuel decades of conflict in Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and beyond. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, promising a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, further complicated the region, creating competing national aspirations that remain unresolved to this day. Economically, Europe was drained. The war had cost billions, leaving national debts soaring. Trade networks were disrupted, industries lay in ruins, and agriculture was in crisis. The United States, relatively unscathed and industrially robust, emerged as a global economic superpower, extending loans to European nations attempting to rebuild. banking and finance shifted across the Atlantic, signaling a transformation of the global economic order. Yet even with American assistance, recovery was slow and uneven, fueling political instability and social unrest. Socially, the war catalyzed profound change. Millions of women had entered factories, offices, and farms during the war, taking on roles previously reserved for men. Their contributions could not be erased, and in the post-war years, the suffrage movement gained momentum. Women in Britain, Germany, and the United States won the right to vote, while social norms around work, education, and public life began to shift. Society, forever altered, faced the challenge of reintegrating men returning from the front and reconciling the new roles women had assumed. Technological and medical innovations developed during the war also transformed post-war society. Aviation technology, mechanized transport, radio communications, and advances in medicine, including treatment for shell shock, chemical injuries, and battlefield surgery, laid the foundation for future progress. Yet the psychological toll was enormous. Veterans suffered from PTSD, then known as shell shock, and civilian populations had endured famine, bombardment, and disease. Art, literature, and philosophy reflected this trauma. Movements like Dadaism and the works of the lost generation captured the sense of disillusionment, questioning values, progress, and the meaning of life in a world shattered by industrialized slaughter. Globally, the war reshaped colonial relationships. Soldiers and resources from colonies in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific had been mobilized to support European powers. Returning soldiers carried new ideas about self-determination and freedom, sowing seeds for independence movements in decades to come. While the victors redrew maps to satisfy strategic interests, they inadvertently ignited nationalist ambitions in regions that had long been under imperial rule. The League of Nations, established in 1920, represented an ambitious attempt to prevent future conflicts. Its goals included collective security, disarmament, and arbitration of disputes. Yet the organization was limited by lack of participation from key powers, most notably the United States, which never ratified the Treaty of Versailles or joined the League. Without universal support, the League struggled to enforce its resolutions, leaving it powerless against rising nationalism, territorial disputes, and economic crises. In Germany, the harsh terms of Versailles, combined with economic hardship, political instability, and social unrest, created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. Nationalist resentment festered, while radical leftist movements also sought revolutionary change. The Weimar Republic, though democratic, faced constant challenges, struggling to maintain legitimacy amid hyperinflation, unemployment, and political violence. The unresolved grievances of the war, coupled with a sense of national humiliation, planted seeds that would later grow into the catastrophic conflicts of the mid-20th century. Across Europe, new nations faced similar challenges. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland had to integrate diverse ethnic groups, establish governments, and rebuild economies amidst scarcity and political tension. In the Middle East, mandates imposed by Britain and France created artificial borders, often ignoring local identities, which generated long-term instability. Across the globe, the geopolitical balance had shifted, marking the emergence of the United States as a major power, the decline of European dominance, and the transformation of colonial relationships. World War I was, in every sense, a turning point in human history. It demonstrated the devastating potential of industrialized warfare, where the distinction between combatants and civilians blurred, and entire societies were mobilized for total war. It exposed the fragility of empires, the volatility of alliances, and the limits of diplomacy in a world driven by nationalism, imperial ambition, and military strategy. Yet from the tragedy emerged change and progress. Women gained new rights and societal roles. nations reevaluated governance, labor rights, and social welfare systems. Medical, technological, and logistical innovations accelerated. While the cost had been unimaginable, the war catalyzed shifts that reshaped societies across the globe. Even as treaties were signed and borders drawn, the legacy of World War I continued to shape politics, economies, and societies. Grievances remained unresolved, from Germany's humiliation to the unfulfilled promises of Arab independence. Economies were fragile and populations traumatized. The League of Nations, though a hopeful experiment, lacked the strength to enforce lasting peace. The stage was set for a new chapter of instability, one that would erupt 2 decades later in the Second World War. The Great War had claimed millions of lives, devastated continents, and altered the trajectory of history, but it also left a profound lesson. The cost of conflict is never confined to the battlefield. It reverberates through societies, economies, and generations, shaping the modern world in ways that cannot be undone. The aftermath of World War I was not just a period of recovery. It was the crucible in which the future of the 20th century was forged, full of both warning and opportunity. The war was over, yet its echoes reverberated through every corner of the globe. Soldiers returned to cities and towns that were changed almost beyond recognition. Families mourned the dead, many of whom would never come home. Europe's urban centers bore the scars of bombardment. Entire streets lay in rubble, factories were shuttered, and railways were disrupted. In the countryside, battlefields had turned fertile soil into cratered wastelands, strewn with barbed wire, unexploded ordnance, and the remains of men and animals alike. The destruction was both physical and psychological, leaving societies struggling to rebuild their identities and livelihoods. One of the most visible transformations was social change. Millions of women who had worked in factories, offices, and farms during the war were reluctant to return to the domestic sphere. Their contributions had been essential to the war effort, and they demanded recognition. In Britain, women over 30 gained the right to vote in 1918, followed by full suffrage in 1928. In Germany, women gained the right to vote in 1919 under the Weimar Constitution. In the United States, the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, ensured women's suffrage nationwide. Beyond political rights, women's presence in the workforce, education, and public life had permanently shifted. New opportunities and freedoms gave rise to a generation of women who were socially and politically active, challenging traditional norms. The psychological impact of the war was profound. Veterans returned with wounds seen and unseen. Shell shock, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, affected millions. Men who had survived the trenches often struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Some turned to alcohol or violence. Others found solace in new movements in art, literature, and philosophy that attempted to make sense of a world that had witnessed such unprecedented destruction. Artists and writers responded to the trauma with creativity that often reflected despair and disillusionment. The lost generation, including writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, captured the sense of aimlessness, grief, and moral questioning that pervaded society. In Germany, the Dada movement emerged, rejecting traditional aesthetics and reflecting the absurdity of a world that had allowed such destruction. Painters, poets, and musicians experimented with form and content, often challenging pre-war norms. Cinema, too, became a powerful medium to depict both the horrors of war and the hopes of recovery, giving rise to storytelling that combined realism with imaginative techniques. Technological innovation, spurred by wartime needs, began to reshape daily life. Aviation, initially developed for reconnaissance and bombing, expanded into commercial and mail transport. aircraft manufacturers, having perfected engines, aerodynamics, and navigation during the war, turned their expertise towards civil aviation. Air travel became a symbol of modernity and progress. Similarly, mechanization in agriculture and industry accelerated, introducing tractors, trucks, and assembly line production to peacetime economies. Communication technology, including radio, telegrams, and early telephones, connected societies in unprecedented ways, shrinking the world and creating a shared global consciousness. The global political landscape was also transformed. The collapse of old empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, led to the creation of new states, often hastily drawn with little regard for ethnic, religious, or linguistic realities. Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Yugoslavia faced the challenge of uniting diverse populations under a single government. Minorities within these nations often felt disenfranchised, sowing tensions that would remain unresolved for decades. In the Middle East, British and French mandates in former Ottoman territories led to nationalist movements as local populations resisted foreign rule. Iraq, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon experienced political unrest driven by unmet promises of independence and rising demands for self-determination. Europe itself faced economic and social turmoil. Germany, burdened by Versailles reparations, struggled with hyperinflation in the early 1920s. In 1923, the German mark became almost worthless. Families carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, and savings evaporated overnight. Economic instability fueled political extremism, paving the way for radical ideologies. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, leveraged post-war discontent to establish a fascist state, emphasizing nationalism and authoritarian control. Across Europe, democratic institutions were fragile, often undermined by economic crisis, political polarization, and social unrest. Meanwhile, the United States experienced the Roaring Twenties, a period of economic boom, cultural experimentation, and social transformation. Industrial production, mass consumerism, and technological innovation fueled optimism. Jazz music, speakeasies, and the Harlem Renaissance reflected a generation eager to embrace life after the trauma of war. Yet even in America, social tensions remained. Racial inequalities, labor strikes, and immigration debates revealed that prosperity was unevenly distributed. The stock market crash of 1929 would soon shatter this optimism, connecting post-war instability in Europe to a global economic depression. Globally, the war reshaped colonial relationships. Soldiers and workers from Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific had contributed to the European war effort, expecting recognition and reform in return. Many returned with heightened political consciousness and a desire for independence. Cultural memory of the war was also being shaped deliberately. Monuments, memorials, and cemeteries were constructed across Europe, honoring the dead and creating sites of collective mourning. Literature, poetry, and visual arts explored the human cost of war, ensuring that the lessons and tragedies were not forgotten. Works like Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front brought the realities of trench warfare to the public imagination, emphasizing the futility and horror of industrialized conflict. These cultural artifacts helped societies process grief while cautioning against the romanticization of war. The war also left a legacy of international institutions aimed at preventing future conflicts. The League of Nations, despite its flaws, represented an unprecedented attempt at collective security and international governance. Its mission included disarmament, arbitration, and oversight of mandates. While its power was limited, especially by the absence of the United States, it established principles that would later influence the creation of the United Nations. The League's successes and failures provided crucial lessons for future diplomacy. revealing both the potential and limits of international cooperation. Meanwhile, science and medicine benefited from wartime advances. Surgical techniques, blood transfusions, and treatment for infectious diseases improved drastically. Rehabilitation for injured soldiers introduced physiotherapy and prosthetics on a scale never seen before. Aviation, radio communication, and chemical research transitioned to civilian applications, transforming daily life. Even agriculture benefited from mechanization and chemical fertilizers developed during wartime research. These innovations accelerated modernization in both Europe and the wider world. Despite these advances, geopolitical tensions persisted. Germany's resentment over Versailles, combined with economic instability and political unrest, created fertile ground for extremist movements, including the Nazi Party. Italy's fascist regime inspired similar nationalist movements elsewhere. Unresolved ethnic disputes in Central and Eastern Europe simmered, while promises of independence in the Middle East remained largely unfulfilled. The world, still grappling with the consequences of industrialized total war, faced a precarious peace, fragile and easily disrupted. The 1920s and 1930s were thus a period of rebuilding, innovation, and tension. Societies recovered slowly from trauma while simultaneously pushing forward technologically, culturally, and politically. Yet the unresolved issues, ethnic tensions, economic hardship, and political extremism, served as a reminder that the war's end did not mean the end of conflict. It had reshaped borders, societies, and global power structures, but it had not solved the underlying problems that had made the conflict possible. In art, literature, and social thought, the war left an indelible mark. Modernism emerged as a reflection of a fractured world, questioning traditional values and exploring the human condition in new ways. In music, jazz and experimental compositions reflected both joy and dissonance. Photography and film preserved the visual memory of the war, making the horrors visible to generations who had not experienced the front lines. The global impact of World War I extended far beyond Europe. Colonial subjects who had fought or labored during the war began organizing for rights and independence. The United States emerged as a dominant economic and political power, its influence extending across both hemispheres. Japan asserted its presence in Asia, foreshadowing future conflicts. Latin America, while not directly involved, was drawn into global trade networks and diplomatic negotiations shaped by the post-war order. World War I had, in essence, reshaped the world, politically, socially, economically, and culturally. The war demonstrated the destructive power of industrialized conflict, the fragility of empires, and the limits of diplomacy. At the same time, it accelerated modernization, expanded rights, and fostered new ideas that would shape the 20th century. Yet the most enduring legacy may have been the lessons unlearned. Borders drawn hastily, ethnic groups dissatisfied, economic injustices unresolved, and political extremism rising, all foreshadowed future conflicts. The peace that followed the war was fragile, temporary, and incomplete. While societies rebuilt and adapted, the shadow of World War I loomed large, reminding humanity that even after the most devastating conflicts, the path to true stability remained uncertain. The world of the 1930s was a fragile place, a landscape of uneasy peace and simmering tensions. Though World War I had ended 2 decades prior, the treaties and settlements that concluded it left more questions than answers. Europe, scarred by the immense human and material cost of the Great War, struggled to rebuild. Economies were fragile, political institutions were weak, and societies bore the psychological wounds of 4 years of total war. The seeds of the next global conflict were quietly taking root. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles had left the nation humiliated and economically crippled. The loss of territory, colonies, and industrial resources created resentment and a sense of injustice among the German population. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s had decimated savings, wiping out the wealth of the middle class. Although the Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 provided temporary financial relief, Germany's economy remained dependent on foreign loans and vulnerable to global shocks. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, unemployment soared, social unrest grew, and faith in the Weimar Republic collapsed. Into this vacuum of despair stepped radical political movements. Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party, capitalized on national humiliation, economic instability, and nationalist fervor. Hitler's message, promising to restore Germany's greatness, overturn Versailles, and provide jobs and security, resonated deeply with a population desperate for hope. Using propaganda, mass rallies, and charismatic oratory, the Nazis gained traction, portraying themselves as the defenders of Germany against both foreign oppressors and internal enemies. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, had already embraced authoritarianism. Mussolini's fascist party, which came to power in 1922, glorified the state, militarism, and nationalism. Fascism offered a model for other authoritarian movements in Europe, emphasizing unity, order, and the suppression of dissent. Mussolini sought to expand Italy's influence in the Mediterranean and Africa, revisiting the imperial ambitions that had been stymied during World War I. In Asia, Japan was rising as a regional power. Having participated on the side of the Allies in World War I, Japan had expanded its territorial holdings in China and the Pacific. Economic pressures and militaristic ambitions, combined with nationalist sentiment, drove Japan to increasingly aggressive actions, including the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The League of Nations condemned the act, but its inability to enforce meaningful sanctions revealed the fragility of international institutions and emboldened other ambitious powers. The global economy was in turmoil. The Wall Street crash of 1929 triggered a worldwide depression, leading to mass unemployment, starvation, and political instability. Governments struggled to respond, often resorting to protectionist policies that worsened international trade. In Germany, the economic crisis fueled extremist parties on both the left and right, creating a volatile political environment. Across Europe, social unrest grew, and traditional democratic institutions were tested by the rise of authoritarian movements. Meanwhile, unresolved territorial disputes from World War I festered. In Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states faced internal ethnic tensions. Minorities dissatisfied with borders drawn by the Treaty of Versailles and other settlements pushed for autonomy or independence. In the Balkans, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia struggled to unite Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes under a single national identity, while Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania jostled over disputed territories. These simmering conflicts created instability that would later be exploited by more aggressive powers. In Germany, Hitler began systematically dismantling the Versailles-imposed restrictions. He reintroduced conscription, rebuilt the military, and openly defied limitations on weaponry and troop numbers. In 1936, German troops reoccupied the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone that Versailles had designated as a buffer against French aggression. The Western powers, particularly Britain and France, largely chose appeasement, hoping to avoid another catastrophic war. This policy of restraint, while intended to preserve peace, emboldened Hitler to continue his expansionist agenda. The Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, became another rehearsal for global conflict. General Francisco Franco, supported by Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, fought against the Republican government, which received backing from the Soviet Union and international volunteers. The war became a testing ground for new military technology, including aircraft, tanks, and artillery tactics. Bombing campaigns, such as the destruction of Guernica, foreshadowed the horrors of aerial warfare that would dominate World War II. The conflict polarized Europe ideologically, highlighting the growing divide between fascism, communism, and liberal democracy. Hitler's ambitions extended further. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, claiming to unite all German-speaking peoples. The international response was muted. Britain and France protested diplomatically but took no military action. Later that year, the Munich Agreement allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia under the guise of protecting ethnic Germans. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously proclaimed, "Peace for our time," believing appeasement could prevent another war. Yet this concession only encouraged Hitler, demonstrating that aggressive actions could achieve territorial gains without immediate consequences. The situation in Eastern Europe also grew tense. Poland, threatened by Germany's growing power, sought alliances with France and Britain. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, wary of German intentions, engaged in diplomatic maneuvers to secure its western borders. In 1939, the world watched with growing unease as Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This agreement shocked the world as it aligned ideologically opposed powers for strategic gain. In Asia, Japanese militarists continued their expansion. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in 1937 as Japan invaded China in full force, capturing cities like Nanking, where atrocities shocked the global conscience. Japanese aggression highlighted the weakness of international enforcement and the inability of the League of Nations to contain militaristic powers. Across the Pacific, colonial powers struggled to respond, revealing the growing vulnerability of far-flung territories. The final act approached swiftly. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland using a blitzkrieg strategy, lightning-fast attacks combining tanks, aircraft, and infantry to overwhelm defenses. The world watched as the fragile peace of the interwar years collapsed. Britain and France, honoring their commitments to Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, marking the official beginning of World War II. The unresolved grievances, unpunished aggressions, economic instability, and rise of extremist ideologies from the aftermath of World War I had converged, plunging the world once again into devastating global conflict. The trajectory from World War I to World War II illustrates the enduring impact of the Great War. The peace settlements of 1919, while intended to secure lasting stability, created grievances, resentments, and power vacuums that ambitious leaders could exploit. Economic crises, social upheaval, and technological advancements accelerated the pace of change while exposing the fragility of peace. Nationalist movements, authoritarian regimes, and militaristic powers found opportunities in the weaknesses left by World War I. The lessons of this period are clear. War, even when ended on paper, leaves unresolved problems that can fester for decades. The decisions made by leaders in the 1920s and 1930s, appeasement, punitive treaties, and delayed responses to aggression, shaped the conditions for the next global catastrophe. Societies that survived the horrors of World War I were forced to confront their vulnerabilities, learn from past mistakes, and navigate an increasingly complex international system. Ultimately, the road to World War II was not inevitable, but it was paved by unresolved conflicts, unhealed wounds, and the failure to address the deep structural problems left by the First World War. Germany's humiliation, Italy's ambition, Japan's expansion, and the fragility of European democracies combined to create a volatile mix. demonstrating how quickly the world could spiral back into global war. By 1939, the lessons of World War I had been partially ignored, and humanity was about to confront the consequences once more. Subscribe to unlock the secrets of the past.